Hello and welcome to Grey Scout Minis. So in this video I'm going to be making some terrain or some like little bits to go with those Minotaur minis that I got from Artisan Guild in the last video. And the idea here is that I'm going to be using this, which is a 3D printed Forgotten Temple piece from Maker's Anvil, and also doing a little bit of crafting using some foam and then just throwing some bits on there. Now, this is a really cool part. It comes off in loads of different pieces. You can print off sort of like rubbled bits of tower. You can print off rubbled bits of this sort of like frame bit that goes around it. And you can also print off a base. But my concern was I didn't want to waste too much resin with something like this. I figured I couldn't really make something like this out of foam without going into a lot of effort, but I can make a base relatively easy. It didn't need to look particularly special. So my thoughts are I'm literally just going to get some foam, pretty much just do a circular base and then kind of bevel it out around the edges so it looks like kind of this stone raised bit. Put a bit of texture on top of it and maybe some additional 3D printed parts to maybe go in the center as well to give it some bits there. That'll save me some resin, it'll raise it up a little bit, and it also keeps it relatively flat so I can use it with just some generic bits. So let's get cracking. So first up I'm going to need to kind of mark out the base, and hopefully this Christmas tin is going to be just about right. I think it needs to be a little bit further out, in fact. So close, but not quite. So if I do mark it, however, let's get right to the edge so we can use up as much foam as possible. There we go. So if I do it like that, it doesn't need to be perfect, obviously, because I'm going to be slicing it up with my hot wire. Haha, now that, fingers crossed, gets all of the pillars in there. Yes, it does. Brilliant. So that should just about work. I guess we'll find out in a minute. And then I could potentially, if I wanted to, have some kind of steppy bit there. Now next, I'm going to use this, which is by Army Painter, I think it was. I actually really like it. At first when I got it, it was just like, what on earth is this? It looks awful, but it does the job. Rather than having something like a Proxon, which just I don't necessarily have the room for at the moment, unless people want to see more videos where I do some foam crafting and stuff like that, it just takes up a lot of room. So always make sure you're in a well-ventilated room when you're using something like this, because obviously it's kicking up a lot of fumes, and ideally you should be wearing some kind of mask. Oh yes! Now I look ready for camera. Righty, here we go. So it's probably the bit where I burn my fingers. So all I'm literally going to do is try to cut out around the edges here. Doesn't need to be perfect. And in fact, probably shouldn't be talking when I've got this on, but having it kind of wonky like I'm doing now will add to that stone-like appearance when you get to the edges. Ooh, I've probably gone a bit too far over there, but I haven't thought this through. I'm not going to reach. Oh no. Right, pull back. Oh. Okay. Right. We're going to have to get really creative. There go some of those yummy fumes that, you know, really help to shorten your lifespan. So ah! Right, here we go. Let's try again. And it is kicking off some smoke right now. Oh yes. And it has paid off. Look at that. We have a circle bit for that to go on, and perfect. That would have been the kicker. Kind of getting to the end and then going, oh, it's too small. Right. So now, obviously, I don't want my rock to kind of be this smooth bit and then smooth. I'm going to cut it at a slight angle all around here. So kind of taking it like so and doing that. It will really help to give some almost slope and everything else. And don't worry about going too far in, because you can always use some kind of texture and everything later on. Cover up any of those bits, but you want to really start to melt it out like that. Now then, just to the camera, as you can see now, instead of it being this just flat and bumpy, it's almost kind of like raised, weathered type rock, and I think it looks really nice. And then if you wanted to, you could then start to kind of indent some pattern on top there. Boom, and we are back. So now we have obviously the top piece, and we have a basic base. And that is obviously going to save me so much resin. It's going to save me so much time as well, not having to 3D print it and everything else. Now, the one thing that I will do next, obviously I want to kind of texture it a little bit. Maybe get some kind of piece, so I'm going to have a look and see through all my spares and everything. I've got some quite nice bases at a really nice circle that could potentially go in the middle as like the center point. And my thoughts are that this is going to be like, once upon a time maybe there was some stone patterning in and everything, but over the years as it's been neglected, it's kind of got worn away, so I'll have loads of like rubble and bits over the top of it. And then I kind of Mod Podge it, so I use a Mod Podge mixed with a black acrylic paint just to really seal it in before I do any of the painting. Now I have primed this grey, but I don't want to do any more work on this until I at least get the base, so that way I can start matching it up and making sure it all fits together nicely. I did have an idea of potentially having this more raised up, but I just figured it's going to take up more space. I'm just keep it a relatively simple build. So I'll get on to the next bit and we will kick off from there. Okay, so we are back and we are in the cave, and I now have this, which looks kind of like a Pokeball, or a Frisbee, or whatever. So I've literally just done a circle in the middle, kind of done some outlines. If I pop it on there, you don't really see too much of it, so I'm not overly bothered. Next bit is the aluminium ball. It's aluminium. And we're going to do some texturing. Not too much, because I'm going to do some flocking and stuff like that. And some of the texture is going to get covered up anyway by Mod Podge. But yeah, let's get it textured. And I really like this method. You can use a rock or something else. I've also got some 3D printed sort of like rollers as well, which are really, really handy if you're doing things like walls or anything else like that. So let's get some texture down. This is just to kind of give it this weathered rock appearance once we get on there. You don't have to be too precious about this, just kind of get it on. Just making some lovely creaky sounds. As well, where we've done that cut with the hot wire, you really want to kind of get in there and just squish it a bit, and then it gives it this more natural transition between the line where it's been cut and also the rest of the rock plateau, so to speak. Right, so this is it. We're at the final sort of texturing and cutting stage. I've got some deep enough grooves there. I used a pencil to kind of score that in, just break up the foam a bit. Next, I am literally just going to paint a Mod Podge. This isn't going to be a particularly advanced build or anything like that. The kind of centerpiece is this. It's the terrain bit that I have 3D printed. I really like this, and it's going to take most of the focus. And as I said, I can switch this out depending on what I'm doing. So if I want to use an altar or something else, I can do that and I'll have that flexibility. So some grease-proof paper, so that way it doesn't stick to my desk, because that'll be a hell of a lot of fun to clean. Obviously my Mod Podge. So this is Mod Podge mixed with some acrylic. You don't want to have it too dark. I think I probably do have it a little bit too dark, but you want it almost like an off black, so to speak. And I'm just going to slather that on. I should probably use a bigger brush for this. It's going to be tedious. But yeah, here we go. Now, one thing that you can risk doing when you use Mod Podge, especially when you've thrown it down as thickly as I'm doing, is obviously leaving brush strokes, but also obscuring a lot of your detail. So it's worthwhile making sure that you do smooth it out over some of those areas where you do want to see that detail. To remove some of that sort of like the brush strokes, either get a sponge or use your brush like so, and start to kind of tap it all over, and it starts to just give it less of an artificial brushed on look, and it just gives it a little bit more texture. Now, I don't know how this is going to turn out in the end, but I've used it on some of like my brick builds for castles and stuff like that, and it always gives it quite a nice texture afterwards. So I do recommend give it a go, see how that works for you. We'll see how it comes out, I guess, once it all dries up and everything. But again, I'm not too worried about this. I think I have put it on too thickly, or I didn't score my lines in deep enough into the foam, so I have lost some of that detail. But once it all soaks in and seals, we'll see how it comes out. And also as well, bear in mind, I am going to be putting down a lot of flocking and everything else to get some of that texture on there. So there we go, voila! Pizza is served. See how that dries, and then we'll pick up the rest of the video. In the meantime, I suppose I best find something else to do. So once the Mod Podge had all dried up, it was pretty easy from that point out. So I was going to dry brush the grey onto the base that I'd done, but instead I was priming some models anyway, so I figured I would use my airbrush for this. Literally sprayed it all with airbrush, and it came out really nice. It gave off this like dusty old stone look, and I was expecting with the airbrush for it to be like this really consistent grey across the whole thing, but actually turned out pretty nicely. So once I had all my base coat and everything done at this point, all I did is I mixed up a black oil wash and a brown oil wash. And if you've watched any of my videos recently, you know that I am a big fan of oil washes. Now, I mixed these a lot thinner than what I normally do when I use on miniatures, so that way it'd run into all the cracks and everything. First up, I started off with like the temple part, and it really ran into those cracks really nicely. Like on the top here, we've got all these runes and everything else. It really just added a lot of depth to those so that way you could really make them out. When obviously it's just that plain grey, you couldn't really pick out the detail as much, but once that oil wash started going on it, it looked fantastic. While the black was still wet, I managed to mix in some of the brown as well, and I just put some dollops all over the place. I wasn't really too sure where I wanted the brown to be, so I just kind of dolloped it all over the place. Now, one thing, because I had mixed this oil wash really thin, is it started to run down it quite a lot, but it wasn't too much of an issue. And once I started putting on like the pillars and everything, it really ran again into all that detail, brought out a lot of that brickwork, where the vines are and everything else, and it just started to look really good. So once that top part was done, I also started to put it onto the base as well. And when I first put some oil wash on there, I was really worried because it started to like spread really slowly and it just looked as though it was seeping into the whole thing. And I figured I had ruined the base at this point. But actually, once I started to slaver it all over, slaver is probably a bad word to use for this, but I slathered it all over and actually it came up really good. I was really surprised actually how good this looked. Again, I did the black and then I kind of threw on some brown as well here and there, and it just looked like it had this kind of old, dirty stuff that kind of maybe decayed or something like that. I really liked the result. So once all of that oil wash had dried, I contemplated hitting it again with a dry brush to bring out some more of that detail and maybe lighten it up, but I figured this is an old gloomy ruin and everything, and I just wanted to leave it in that sort of dark state. So at that point, I then had the decision to make as to whether or not I was going to stick it to the base, and I decided I would. I figured if I didn't do it, I'd probably end up losing the base or breaking the base, so having it all stuck together just made sense. So I stuck it all together with a little bit of PVA glue, and then once I'd done that, I started to put down some just little bits of textures. So the first thing is I had this like dirt that I sprinkled all over, and I also used some like vines and moss, and I also threw in a little bit of grass as well. And all in all, I think it looks really good at this stage. Now it's all complete, I really like the final result. I think it looks fantastic, and it didn't really take too much effort. See, the only thing really that I was crafting was that base, and to be honest, with the minimum amount of effort that I put in there, obviously kind of getting a pencil and just cutting a circle ultimately, it actually came out really good, and it just doesn't take away from the top piece, but it adds to it nicely. In hindsight, looking at this, I would have done a better job of filling all the gaps and holes when I put the model together in the first place, because you can still make those out. I put a bit of moss over one of them, but I didn't want to put it in each kind of corner because it'd really stand out that obviously I'd missed the gaps and I'd done that. So they are there and they are noticeable if you look for them, but I'm not overly bothered about it. And I really like the way this has come out. It's definitely going to be a nice little piece for my little Minotaur warriors to kind of gather around, do whatever the hell they're doing there, and definitely going to be a good one to throw onto the game table as well. So I hope you've enjoyed that video, and if you have, hit the like and subscribe button and come along for some more content in the future. And if you want me to do some more of this 3D printed terrain and maybe some crafting stuff as well, let me know in the comments what sort of thing you'd like to see in the future. I've got this idea floating around in my head that I'd quite like to do a tavern and print off loads of different villager miniatures to go with that, but I'm not entirely sure what that looks like and whether or not you guys will be interested in that anyway. So let me know in the comments. In the meantime, stay safe and I'll see you soon. Bye.